A cool evening in 1832 in the newly established town of Ibadan. The leader of the town, a mighty warrior from nearby Ife known as Maye Okwade, was taking an evening stroll around the center of the town, which was occupied mainly by Ife like Maye and the Oyo warriors and refugees who had come from the metropolitan region of the Oyo Empire in the north after the empire collapsed. Suddenly, he stumbled on two men quarreling. What the quarrel was about has now been lost to history, but it was heated enough that Maye went in to adjudicate on the spot. At this point, Maye listened to both sides. One of the men was from the town of Owu that had been destroyed 12 years earlier. The other was from the former Oyo heartland. It didn't take long for Maye to rule in favor of the Owu man. If he had stopped there, perhaps history would have gone differently. But Maye went ahead to carry out judgment on the spot. Swiftly, he drew his sword and cut the head of the Oyo man off. Other Oyo men who had been observing raised an alarm. The feared killing of Oyo men in Ibadan by Maye and his Ife followers had begun, or so they thought. Panic ensued, and the more populous Oyo took up their weapons. After some fighting by both sides inside Ibadan town, Maye and his contingent retreated from the town. This little spark was what ignited what came to be known as the Gbanamu War. Literally, the war in which they caught fire with their hands. To properly understand the events, we must go back to 1810, when most historians agree that the largest of the West African empires south of the River Niger, the Oyo Empire, began to tear itself apart from within when the leader of the Oyo armies, Afonja, based in the northern town of Ilorin, with the title of Ààrẹ Ọ̀nà Kakanfò, the Generalissimo, led a rebellion against the Aláàfin of Oyo, Aláàfin Aole at the time. We will get into details of this in a subsequent episode. But by 1817, Afonja's revolt was complete, and the towns in the heart of Oyo were either fighting each other or being raided by Afonja and his Fulani allies from Ilorin. Shameful plug, or shameless plug as you may be, this is what my book is about, so get the book. It was in one such raid that one of the most famous Nigerians, a young boy called Ajayi, who would later become known as the Bishop Samuel Ajayi Crowder, would be captured from his hometown of Oshogun, also in the Oyo heartland, and sold into slavery, being rescued by the British and freed into Sierra Leone in 1821. This began what would be known as 80 years of nearly non-stop war in the Yoruba country, in what is now known as the Yoruba Civil Wars, only ending in 1894 when the Kiriji War finally ended with British adjudication. The result of this, of course, was a mass movement of people from the more populous Oyo heartland in the north towards the less populous forested regions in the south. Now, similar to how those who were displaced by the more well-known Zulu conquest of southern Africa in what is known as the Mfecane, happening around the same time under Shaka, went on to apply similar tactics to conquer those that they met as they fled the onslaught of the Zulus. The Oyo warriors, fleeing the destruction of the Oyo heartland in the hands of Ilorin Fulani, organized into marauding bands of warriors and attacked other towns as they fled. One such town, relevant to our story today in this episode, was the fortified town of Owu. Owu was first attacked unsuccessfully in 1811 by another southern polity, the Ife. Ife is known as the cradle of Yoruba civilization. This attack was in retaliation to Owu's attack of an Ife market town called Akpomu. Akpomu has a lot to do in Yoruba history, and one of these days I'll do an episode about Akpomu. However, by 1817, the bands of Oyo warriors moving south decided to side with the Ife, and joined by a third party, the Ijebu, they combined to attack the Owu once more. This particular attack lasted 5 years, after which Owu was utterly destroyed. This war, known rather creatively as the Owu War, was the precursor to what we are talking about today. We will talk about the Owu War in more details in another episode. Crucially, one of the Egba towns of the forest, called Ikija, who were rivals to Ijebu, had sided with Owu in this war. Of course, as soon as the Ife Oyo Ijebu band destroyed Owu, the next thing they did was to turn their attention to Ikija to bring vengeance on them for supporting their enemy. Seeing an opportunity, because the Egba towns were fiercely independent of each other, there were about 153 of them at this time. The Oyo, Ijebu, Ife allies began to pick them off one after the other, destroying most of the towns in the Egba forest between 1819 and 1828. Interestingly, some of the Egba from a formerly destroyed Egba township will join these warriors to destroy the next Egba town. Such was the craze in this time. The band was less about which sub-tribe you belong to and more about an opportunity to plunder, get booty, and get slaves to sell. The result of this was that many of the former Egba towns that were at the edge of the forest were settled by these bands, while those inside the forest proper were abandoned. Since the Oyo, who constituted the bulk of these men, were more at home in less forested areas that resembled their savanna homeland in northern Yoruba land. One of these towns, settled first temporarily in 1827 and more permanently by 1829, is where we are today, the town of Ibadan. The other was Ijaye, less than 40 kilometers away from Ibadan. Crucially, while Ijaye was led by an Oyo man from the town of Esiele called Kurumi, who history now knows as Kurumi of Ijaye, and it was hence primarily full of Oyo warriors and refugees, Ibadan was led by an Ife man, Maye Okunade. Even his second in command was also an Ife man, Alaboshinde, even though he had an Oyo mother. Perhaps due to this, Ibadan was a lot more pluralistic, having Ife, Ijebu, Egba, Oyo, and even Owu people in the town. But the Oyo were by far the most populous in the town. Together with the town that most of the Egba that survived the destruction of the Egba forest and the Owu that survived the Owu War fled to Abeokuta. These three towns, Abeokuta, Ibadan, and Ijaye, became the biggest towns in Yoruba land in the 1800s, and they also became keen rivals. We will talk more about the rivalries later, so there's a lot more to talk about in this history. A difference in what Ibadan represented to the Oyo contingent in the town, who saw it as a new home, since their former homes were destroyed by Afonja and his band of Fulani allies, and what the rest of the group personified in Maye, who was from nearby Ife, and who saw Ibadan as merely a temporary place from where they could raid and plunder. This difference created tensions between both sides. It was the tension that spilled over in the quarrel we saw at the beginning of this episode between the Oyo man and the Owu man, and which ignited the Gbanamu War that we are talking about. Now that we have set the context, join me in the next episode as we delve into the details of the Gbanamu War.